Hi, I'm Sterling Zollinger, and for my movement analysis project, we're going to be going over the back tuck.
We're going to start in a stance about shoulder width apart in a fairly athletic, comfortable position. Our hands are going to start by our sides, and we're just going to be nice and extended out. Then we're going to come down into a coiling position so that we can coil up and jump up as high as we can. When we come down in this position, we want to bend about at a 45-degree angle at our hips as well as our knees. If we bend too far down to 90, it's going to take away our momentum in the jump. If we don't bend far enough, we won't be able to jump high enough. So it's really important that we bend about right at more or less a 45-degree angle. We also are going to bring our arms in front of us as well as to the side. This keeps us from falling back as well as falling forward in the jump so that we can have a nice, clean, smooth jump. When we're ready for that phase, that next step, our arms are going to come up at the same time that we extend our muscles and our body all the way up in the jumping position. Once we reach the highest point in that jump, we want to bring our knees up to our chest. We bring our trunk and our neck down to our knees, and then we bring our arms around and pushing it up. The momentum of the jump and our actions of flexing at the core and coming kind of like a small ball makes it so that we can easily rotate in a 360-degree flip. After that rotation is done up in the air, we then need to quickly extend back out and land in an athletic position again, more or less shoulder width apart and having our arms out for balance once again. If we land too far this way, we can hyperextend our knees and any other sorts of injuries. So it's more or less like this from a side angle. Some common mistakes that people do with the standing back tuck is when they get to the part of the phase, the jumping up in the air, they'll rotate as they're jumping up, so it causes them to jump back kind of like a backflip motion, or they'll jump up in the air and then they'll rotate too late. So if you jump too early, a lot of times you can still make it work and you'll be safe and there won't be any injury, but it causes you to do like a backflip instead of a back tuck. And a lot of times you'll over rotate too, which makes it so you'll land and you can fall back, you can cause injury to yourself. But more importantly, you don't want to rotate too late, because if you rotate too late, you get up in the air, you start to come down, and then you rotate, you'll land in this kind of position and you can hurt your knees, you can hurt your ankles. But even worse, if you really don't rotate very much and you rotate too late, you can come and you can land on your head, and that can cause spinal injuries. Okay, now we're going to go over the joints in each phase of the standing back tuck. For phase one is the loading phase, which is the phase of going down like this and getting ready to coil up for the jump up into the air. The first joint we're going to talk about is the acetabular-femoral joint, which is also known as the hip joint. When we bend down like this, that joint, the acetabular-femoral joint, is flexing. The muscles that are involved in that flexion are your semitendinosus, semimembranosus, biceps femoris, and the gluteus maximus. This flexion is an eccentric contraction. The next motion in the loading phase occurs in the tibiofemoral joint. As we bend down, we have knee flexion in the tibiofemoral joint. The muscles that are involved in this flexion include our quadricep muscles, the vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, and rectus femoris. The action and the contraction that's happening as we lower down is also eccentric, just like the hip flexion. The third motion that occurs in the loading phase occurs in our ankle joint, or the talocrural joint. As we bend down like this, there's dorsiflexion that occurs in the talocrural joint. There's a lot of muscles that are involved in this. Those include the gastrocnemius, the soleus, the peroneus longus, the tibialis posterior, the flexus hallucis longus, and the peroneus brevis, as well as the flexor digitorum longus. Those muscles, just like the knee and hip joint, are flexing eccentrically. The biomechanical concept that occurs with the first phase, the loading phase, is the stretch reflex. As we squat down partially, we obviously know that our quadriceps muscles are stretching. When this happens, the muscle spindles in our quadriceps muscles detects a stretch, and it then sends an impulse to the CNS. As a response, the CNS then causes those quadricep muscles to contract. The antagonist muscle, the hamstrings, are inhibited when these muscles contract. That's what makes it so that we can then jump up smoothly, makes it so that there's not a counter flexion or contraction going on. Move on to the second phase of the standing back tuck, which is the jumping phase. So we're going to start with the first movement in the hip joint or the acetabular joint. This time we're having hip extension. Obviously we're coming from the squat position and going up, so our hips are extending out. The muscles that are involved in that are including the semitendinosus, the semimembranosus, the gluteus maximus, and the biceps femoris long head. This contraction that is happening is a concentric contraction. The second motion that's happening occurs at the tibiofemoral joint, the knee joint. This is knee extension. The muscles that are involved in the knee that go from the squatting position to extending up include our quadricep muscles, so our vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, as well as the rectus femoris. As we're coming up, this is a concentric contraction because the flexor muscles are being contracted to help us extend fully up to a jumping position. The third motion that's occurring when we're in the jumping phase of the standing back tuck occurs at the talocrural joint and has an ankle plantar flexion. So we're extending our ankle out. The muscles that are involved in that include the peroneus brevis, the peroneus longus, the flexor digitorum longus, the flexor hallucis longus, the gastrocnemius, the soleus, and the tibialis posterior. These muscles, same as the hip and knee joint, are contracting concentrically. The biomechanical concept for the jumping phase, phase 2 in the standing back tuck, is Lombard's paradox. That's where the hamstring muscle as well as the quadricep muscle both contract to help us stand up or even jump up. Normally, two opposing muscles, when they contract, it causes you to just hold still. But because of Lombard's paradox, this makes it so we can stand up and so that we can jump up. And the biomechanics behind that is the quadricep muscle has a longer moment arm at the knee joint, and this is due to the kneecap. So basically the kneecap makes it so that it's longer, which means we have more torque in our knee, whereas the hamstring has a longer moment arm at the hip joint. This makes it so that we have more torque occurring at the hip. So with Lombard's paradox, even though an antagonist and an agonist muscle are flexing at the same time, the hamstrings and the quads, since the more torque is here at the knee for the quads and more torque is here for the hamstrings, when both those contract, that difference of torque makes it so that we can stand up and even jump up. So the third phase of the standing back tuck is the tucking phase. The first joint that we're going to talk about in the tucking phase is the tibiofemoral joint or knee joint. As we get up in the air high enough and we're ready to tuck, our knees come up to our chest in this motion. So we're going to have knee flexion. The muscles that are involved in that knee flexion include the semitendinosus, the semimembranosus, the biceps femoris, the gracilis, the gastrocnemius, and then weak knee flexion from the sartorius. This kind of contraction happens concentrically. The next motion that occurs in the tucking phase, the standing back tuck, occurs at all vertebral faucet joints. This makes it possible for us to have trunk flexion. So as our knees come up to our chest, our trunk and our neck has to flex down to connect with the knees so that we can curl up into a ball and there's no wind resistance, which makes it easier for us to complete that back tuck motion. The muscles involved in this trunk flexion as our knees and our trunk ball up together is our internal abdominal obliques bilaterally as well as our external abdominal obliques bilaterally. The rectus abdominis as well as more towards our neck, our sternocleidomastoids contract bilaterally, which makes it so that we can curl up into a ball. All four of those muscles are contracting concentrically. So the third motion that happens in the tucking phase occurs at the humeral ulnar joint, so our elbow joint. As our knees come up and as our trunk flexes, our arms have to come around that as we ball up. This causes flexion at the elbow joint. Some muscles that occur, or some muscles that contract at this, are the pronator teres, the brachialis, the brachioradialis, as well as the biceps brachii. These arm muscles at the elbow joint are all contracting with flexion concentrically as they come closer to the body and contract with our knee and our trunk flexors. And this upward motion that comes towards our body actually carries momentum so that we can completely finish the back tuck and land safely. The biomechanical concept behind the third phase of the standing back tuck, the tucking phase, is simply force. Force equals mass times acceleration. The mass part of the equation is the human body. The human body has a fairly large mass, which makes it possible for acceleration to happen. Acceleration is momentum that occurs from movement. That's possible because of our muscles. So as our muscles contract when we're down here, that rapid contraction causes the body, the mass of the body, to gain momentum and jump up into the air due to acceleration. Acceleration is basically a change in velocity. So as our muscles contract, it gives us force because the contraction carries the mass of the human body into acceleration, which makes it so that we can get up into the air, and that momentum then continues to cause the body to spin in a 360-degree motion and finish the flip of the back tuck as follows.